Hi, everybody. This is Jayant again. I've been getting a lot of direct messages and some comments also on my quick lesson yesterday about the aperture priority versus manual mode shift and why people tend to go to manual mode and stuff like that. Off late, I've been hearing this a lot from people who have found a new friend in the manual mode and of course partnering with the auto ISO feature of your camera. So if you have not used this, basically what people do is, let's say they go to the manual mode and they have some shutter speed in mind that they want, which is, let's say, the minimum shutter speed that they would prefer to make a picture where it's not blurry, shaky and stuff like that. So for the sake of academics, let's say 1 by 500th of a second is the shutter speed that all of these guys like. There was one old film school theory that if you have a 500 lens, you should have a shutter speed of minimum 1 by 500th of a second. If you have a 300 lens, shutter speed should be 1 by 300th minimum, and if not more, and stuff like that. So anyway, that's just a thumb rule to guide people when they should start worrying about a shutter speed. Now let's say Mr. X has kept manual mode and has chosen a shutter speed of 1 by 500th of a second, which is going to be remaining constant. Now let's say for depth of field reasons, they also want to keep an aperture of, let's say, f 8, for example. I don't need to debate why. It's that person's wish. They want to keep f8 for whatever reason. Some people use smaller apertures to get a little deeper depth of field. Some people think their 5.6 lens is not as sharp as it can be at one stop lesser and stuff like that. So without getting into debates on that, let's say the person chose to keep f8 of aperture and of course 1 by 500th of a second shutter speed. Now the third parameter is of course the ISO. The chances are we need to set the right ISO for this shutter speed and for this aperture combination. And let's say, ideally speaking, ISO 500 was the right ISO for this combination to make the exposure triangle perfect. All right, so the method here we are talking about, which is manual mode in association with an auto ISO, is we can set a feature called auto ISO where we tell the camera that I want you to use a minimum of 100 ISO and I want you to use a maximum of 6400 ISO, these numbers being examples. You can set the range of ISO the camera can keep in auto ISO method, and this is something many people are using in the recent times to enjoy, not worrying about a slow shutter speed that will get a blurry shot, nor worry about an aperture that will mess around with their pictures. So they are happy to do this kind of manual mode setting with auto ISO, and to be honest, it works most of the times. There are some reasons why I don't use this all the time, and the number one reason is, let's say Jayant was using an aperture priority mode with f5.6 and ISO 500, and the camera would calculate the shutter speed and give, let's say, 1 by 1000th of a second shutter speed. Now in this setting, let's say X, Mr. X we were talking about, is using manual mode and using F, let's say for the sake of academics again, F5.6 itself. And since they have set a particular ISO, which is auto ISO with manual mode, and they have set a particular shutter speed of 1 by 500th of a second, the camera is now going to decide an ISO automatically. Now, while both of them will get the correct exposure, because here the camera is actually setting the shutter speed because we have given the input of aperture and ISO. Here the camera is setting the ISO because we have given the input of aperture and shutter speed. So technically speaking, since the third parameter of the exposure triangle is set by the camera, both of these guys would get the correct shot. So 95% of the times there is no need to worry. But my point is, who decided 1 by 500th of a second in Mr. X's picture? It was Mr. X himself. Now, sometimes we tend to keep a shutter speed that we call as a minimum that we require, and we forget that we will always be in the minimum that we require. In this case, Jayant is enjoying more than minimum. While he wants a minimum of 500th of a second like Mr. X, but he is not restricting his minimum to be the only shutter speed. If you look at the difference here, when let's say it's cloudy, Mr. X is going to make sure his shutter speed is at least 1 by 500. There is a risk Giant is running that his shutter speed might end up being 1 by 320 or 1 by 200, which is really slow, and Giant might get a slow shutter speed shake. But Mr. X is going to get a minimum of 1 by 500. The camera is going to continue increasing the ISO to, let's say, 800 or 1000 or whatever, to make sure this shutter speed is correct. Now, on the positive side, what happens to Giant is, if the light is slightly improving, let's say the cloud went away and the sun is a little brighter than otherwise, he is getting a shutter speed of 1 by 1000th of a second, which Mr. X will never get, because Mr. X is busy making sure his minimum is what he wants. The camera will stick to his minimum, which happens to be his maximum as well, and he always gets 1 by 500th of a second in his shots. So while there is an advantage of setting a minimum, there is also a disadvantage that you will never go beyond that number. Whereas Giant, who keeps an eye on his shutter speed, knows that when the shutter speed has gone to 1 by 320th or 200th of a second, it's time for me to look at my ISO. Maybe 500 was not enough. I need to move that to 1000 ISO, whereby I would get a 640th of a second, which is slightly more than even 1 by 500th of a second shutter speed. So this happens to be my number one reason why I do not stick to manual mode with auto ISO, because sometimes I will be happy to get more than the minimum shutter speed. So in this case, 1 by 1000th of a second, 640th of a second, which is much better than sticking to a minimum shutter speed of 1 by 500th of a second. Now, that is something you can think of. Number two reason, which I can think of, which is probably the reason why I don't really embrace manual mode with auto ISO all the time, is one of the two drastic situations. The drastic situation is, let's say you're shooting in Kabini and it's undergrowth, there is leopard or a tiger or a wild dog, whatever, and you have fixed your usual 1 by 500th of a second shutter speed. You have f8 or f5.6 or whatever, and of course the camera is setting an ISO which is set by itself, which is an auto. So we are talking about a manual mode usage here, and in this case there is one problem which can happen though, guys. So let's say suddenly you saw a peregrine falcon fly in the sky, or let's say there is a black-shouldered kite which is hovering in the sky, and you simply point your camera towards the sky, and let me even draw that. Let's say this is the sky and there's a bird here which is hovering around, and you want to take a picture of that. Now the point is, since you have kept 1 by 500th of a second, you have already increased the aperture to really closer to the maximum possible. The camera will now start setting the ISO. Now chances are, if it's a blue sky bright day, the camera is going to struggle to go to an ISO which is the lowest ISO, let's say 100, or in Nikon cameras some cases 50 ISO, and it keeps 50 ISO or 100 ISO, and still it is going to overexpose the shot because it probably needs a faster shutter speed than what is being given. It needs a 1 by 2000th of a second shutter speed even at 100 ISO at the biggest aperture, or it needs a smaller aperture of f11 or f14 and stuff like that. Since you fix these two and there is no way for the camera to go below 100 ISO, in this scenario it is going to suffer and overexpose this picture and make it an overexposed bright white sky, until when you'll realize that it's time for you to increase the shutter speed or decrease the aperture to start getting the exposure to zero, which is one of the interesting use cases where manual mode with auto ISO probably can have a problem. On the contrary, the third one is something that I recently heard of, which is an interesting problem to have, which of course is very subjective with respect to the light. Let's say you are in Kabini or in Ranthambore and you're seeing an extremely rare situation It's ideally not a good photo op situation. It's extremely rare situation. Now let's say you have told your camera the ISO range is 100 to 6400 ISO, and it will not go to 8000 ISO, or it will not go below beyond 100 because it doesn't have. So now if this is the setting you have done for ISO auto, let's say you're on f5.6, you're on let's say 1 by 500th of a second, and this is the range the camera is going to give you. Let's look at this scenario. Let's say it's a very rare situation, low light, 6:30, 6:45, you're coming out of the park, and it's once in a lifetime moment that you're seeing. Now, if you pinpoint your camera towards this scene, the camera is not going to be able to produce a picture properly, because even this ISO is not sufficient in this example. It's very dark. So this is already a relatively small aperture, though it's the largest in your lens. This is probably a fast shutter speed. Maybe for this aperture and even this ISO, it needed a 1 by 200th of a second or 1 by 100th of a second shutter speed. So it is going to make a picture pretty dark, because you have fixed it to a limitation that it cannot go beyond. So in this case, it's going to be a pretty dark image. Now, depending on how dark it is from what it's supposed to be, you can recover it by increasing the brightness of your picture. Now, if it is too far away from the ideal exposure, you are going to get an extremely noisy image when you brighten it. Now, the reason why you don't want to go beyond 6400 ISO is noise. Now, imagine making a picture at the ISO which is comfortable for you, but making a completely darker image, because of which you'll need to go to post-processing methodologies to brighten the image, where you'll again get high noise. So, which is one of the third reasons why I'm not a great fan of manual mode with auto ISO all the time. So if you ask me, guys, if this is my pie chart of exposure, I think 95% of the times I am on aperture priority mode. I'm on shutter priority mode about 2 to 3% of the times, and the remaining percent of the times I am on manual mode, and mostly manual mode with manual ISO, and sometimes with auto ISO. So if you noticed, for any methodology that you use, there will be a situation where you will not be able to cater to all the kinds of requirements of the natural light and scene. So you will need to worry about all of them. So for example, let's say you are shooting aperture priority mode. In this case, the typical problem is your slow speeds, and if the shutter speed is slow, you need to increase the ISO, and at some stage ISO starts giving noise, so you have a problem. That means you have to change your camera if you're not happy with higher ISOs. Number two, let's say you're on manual mode and you don't even meter the camera properly. You have a problem of getting darker images, and you basically need to brighten it later on. Number three, manual mode with auto ISO. It is again a problem when you start fixing a maximum or a minimum shutter speed. You cannot go beyond this, which is a shame, because your camera is capable of producing 1 by 8000th of a second shutter speed as well. On the other side, you do get pictures which are pretty dark like this one if you limit your ISO to a range where you're not able to change that. Like for example, this one, you're not able to change that, and you will still get too dark pictures at times, because of which you'll need to brighten your picture and you'll start ending up getting noise. The fourth scenario is shutter priority. Now, the reason why I really don't recommend shutter priority for action shots is because you'll again make the mistake of coming up with a faster shutter speed, and the camera is supposed to choose an aperture, and let's say in this case it is chosen an X aperture, which is still going to get you a darker image because it wants a bigger aperture than this. Let's say you chose the aperture, or the camera chose the aperture of f5.6, and it was not enough to produce this image at 1 by 1000th of a second, because it needed an aperture of f4 or f2.8 or something like that, which is why it will make a picture darker. Which means, guys, there is no mode which can work all the time. If you have heard anybody who says I always use this, or I always use this, or always use this, or always use this, they really have not put them to test in all the kind of situations. If you are a really accomplished photographer, you need to use different tools for different situations. It's like having a screwdriver, a spanner, a star screwdriver, also an Allen wrench, all these kind of tools in your toolkit. And depending on what the problem is, what do you need to tighten and unscrew and fix and bolt and hammer, you need different tools for different situations. So please do not promote any particular tool, because that is not enough to fix all the problems. And likewise in photography, don't keep only doing this or that, because there are some situations where you need different tools, which is why even the most professional cameras in the world have an aperture priority mode. Most professional cameras in the world have a shutter priority mode. All the cameras in the world have a manual mode. All the cameras in the world have ISO capabilities. But if you've noticed, pro cameras do not have auto exposure. Like for example, if you buy a camera like a Sony A9 II or a A7R4 or a 1DX Mark III or a Nikon D6, and if you're given an auto mode, which is an auto exposure mode, that is a shame, because you don't need to buy a camera like that to do auto exposure. Having said that, do not think that using aperture priority, shutter priority, ISO, auto ISO, manual mode is actually as disrespecting as it seems like to you guys. So please use all the tools possible in your camera. Do not stick to anything all the time. Depending on different kinds of situations, you might need to change your tools. Another analogy I can give you is like somebody saying, hey, you know what, I love to drive my car always in the third gear. Isn't that stupid? When you want to start the car, you need the first gear, and little later you need the second gear. At some stage you need the third gear, and at some stage you need the fourth gear and fifth, and definitely reverse gear also at times. So likewise, think of each one of these as specific tools which have a specific purpose. If you stick to one all the time, you're not putting yourself in situations which are challenging enough. You need to change the different modes according to the scene. I hope that helps. I'll be happy to answer any more questions. Please feel free to comment on the post, ask me questions in a direct message, or you can even send me a mail, or you know how to get in touch with me. Good luck, guys. Take care.